Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
What's new from Apple? There's the new iPhone 16 Pro, built for Apple Intelligence. And it comes with the all-new camera control, giving you an easier way to quickly access your camera tools. The new Apple Watch Series 10 has our biggest display and our thinnest design ever. And this? It's the sound of active noise cancellation, now available on one of two new AirPods 4 models. So quiet. Check out all of the new products and new features at apple.com. You can even buy yourself something new. See apple.com for product availability updates. Apple Intelligence coming this fall.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from Whales. Written by W. Watkin Davies and published in 1925, this story looks at the history of whales. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community that we have built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. Of course, a massive thank you goes to the patrons on Patreon. Your monthly subscriptions allow me to keep producing more episodes. As I mentioned, my goal is to keep this podcast free. This is why you'll hear a quick ad at the beginning of each episode. It helps generate financial support for the creation of the podcast. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 a month, which also removes the Spotify ads and supports episode creation. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you'd like to say hello to me, you can always do that by visiting theboytosleep.com website. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. Whales by W. Watkin Davies. Chapter 1. Beginnings. From the low chain of sand dunes which fringes the northeastern coast of France can be discerned, on a day of ordinary brightness, the great cliffs of Kent. Frequently they are overhung by the dark and damp canopy which has given to our island the evil reputation of being the home of eternal mist and night. But occasionally the sun strikes them, and they appear brilliantly white and alluring. To the French shore have come, in the course of centuries, wave after wave of wandering peoples, men impelled by every sort of motive, fear of stronger foes, love of plunder, and eagerness for adventure. They have come. They have seen the beckoning white cliffs so enticing in their mystery, and have crossed over and essayed to make them their own. Thither only the other day came the ruthless German, bent upon striking at the tiny heart of so vast an empire. Thither 100 years before came Napoleon, reluctant that any part of Europe should challenge his overlordship. Thither 8 centuries earlier had come the polished and adventurous Norman, eager to win broad acres and martial renown beyond the sea. Still earlier had come the Danes, plunderers rather than settlers, but men who had nevertheless left an abiding mark upon the heterogeneous population of the island. The Danes had but followed in the wake of the German tribes who had come over, conquered, and bestowed a new name upon the larger and more fertile part of Britain. It is with the arrival of these last named people that the history of England begins, but the history of Wales must be traced to a far earlier origin. Indeed, we can trace the descent of the people, who now inhabit the hills and valleys of the westernmost parts of Britain, to those dim prehistoric times about which only geology, ethnology, philology, and archaeology can enlighten us. And at an even earlier date than that this country was inhabited by man, but the ice of the north descended upon the land, and all the higher forms of life became extinct. Between the men of the pre-glacial and the men of the post-glacial age in Britain, no link has as yet been discovered. The Britain revealed to our eyes when science first raises the curtain is not the Britain that which we today know. The mountains were higher, and the chalk hills had not assumed their present smooth and rounded shape. It was not then an island, but part of a mighty continent, parts of which are now submerged beneath the waters of the North Sea, the English Channel, and the Atlantic. In all probability, a great river flowed through what are now the Straits of Dover. The climate, however, apparently did not differ to any marked degree from which now prevails. Over this continent roams many animals, some of which are entirely extinct, and others which have long fled either to the colder north or to the warmer south. They included the mammoth, the cave lion, the bear, the rhinoceros, the hyena, the hippopotamus, the bison, the reindeer, the elk, and the wild horse. The men who lived with and hunted these beasts were very low in the scale of civilization. Indeed, the only evidence of the possession by them of any culture at all is a number of sketches or paintings of animals upon the walls of caves and on domestic utensils. The art displayed in these figures is extremely rudimentary, and between them and the pictures seen at the modern exhibition the gulf is a wide one. But the primitive artist undoubtedly possessed one sovereign merit. He left the beholder in no doubt as to the meaning of the picture. To these earliest inhabitants of Britain, the name men of the Old Stone Age has been given. Their sense of the artistic must have been far more highly developed than their sense of the comfortable. Their dwellings were caves, and those without any sort of furniture. Of manufactures they knew nothing. They neither wove cloth nor moulded clay. Their clothing must have consisted of the skins of animals which they killed, and as the evidence seems to indicate that they were not cannibals, the same animals must have provided them with food. Since they knew nothing about the use of metals, all their hunting and all their fishing must have been carried on with weapons of stone, and indeed a plentiful stock of their arrowheads and axes has survived. To this period, it is quite impossible to assign even an approximate date. It may have been as late as 10,000 years ago, but it may just as easily have been 100,000. When the snow and the ice had departed and left a country which men could once again inhabit, the outward aspect of Britain had greatly altered. It was now an island, differing only in minor details from the Britain which we now know. With the restoration of a milder climate, man returned. But the great beasts did not come back, and henceforth we hear only of the dog, the horse, the ox, the sheep, the pig, the goat, and the wolf. The age which then opened is known as the Neolithic or New Stone Age. The use of metals had not yet been discovered, and all weapons and tools were made of stone, but there was a marked improvement in their manufacture. The type of civilization was evidently higher. Hunting and fishing, together with incessant fighting, were still the chief operations of man. But to these pursuits had now been added the tending of flocks and herds. The art of weaving, too, had been discovered, and skins had made way for brightly coloured cloth garments. Pots, jugs, and dishes of every variety were baked, many of them accurate and graceful in their outline. Finally, the people of the New Stone Age had learned to be agriculturalists, and that led to them abandoning nomadic habits for fixed settlements where, in time, villages came to be built. Many of these earliest villages were built in lakes, and traces of them have been discovered in Wales and Llangors Lake. Who these people were is a question which cannot be answered with even the slightest degree of certitude. Indeed, the whole problem of race in those early times is so obscure as to make a study of it almost altogether barren and unprofitable. One thing only is certain, and that is that throughout the New Stone Age, the people who dwelt in Britain were not the Celts. As not a word of their language has survived, it is difficult to determine whether they were members of the great family called Aryans, to which the whole present population of Europe, with the exception of Finns, Turks, and Hungarians, belongs. Of these people, it is probable that 3 successive waves arrived. In many things they differed, but were alike in being all extremely dark. Their descendants constitute the most pronounced element in the population of modern Wales. The traditional name for the men of the New Stone Age is the Iberians. Before the Celtic invasion, a more or less homogeneous people inhabited the British Isles, France, Spain, and northern Italy. The use of the term Mediterranean as a substitute for Iberian has been suggested. To its use there is only one real objection, and that is that it is almost wholly devoid of meaning. Some recent writers, rejecting both these terms, have used the term Hamitic, a family of languages closely allied to the Semitic. This novel theory has been based upon two grounds. First, the Irish and Welsh languages, although drawing their vocabulary from Celtic or Aryan sources, have a syntax paralleled in Berber and Egyptian. No one who has seen them can fail to perceive the remarkable similarity between the physiognomy of the Berber peoples of northern Africa and the prevailing type of South Wales Welshmen. Second, there is identity of culture and of religion, not only between the Neolithic inhabitants of Britain and those of North Africa, but also between them and the people of Egypt and Babylon. A high stage of civilization was attained by these people. The building of Stonehenge would in itself be proof enough of their engineering skill. It is likely that there was continuous contact between Britain in those days and the great cradles of civilization, the valleys of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, and that traders brought to the distant isle not only foreign wares but new knowledge and up-to-date ideas. When or how the Stone Age passed into the Age of Bronze, we do not know. Bronze was used in Egypt at least as early as the 4th millennium BC, and in all likelihood it was introduced into Britain in the ordinary course of trade. Whenever it came, there can be no doubt that it speedily wrought a complete revolution in mankind's way of living. In Britain, bronze was not only the metal to be largely used. There were famous gold mines in Ireland, copper in Wales, and tin in Cornwall. The men of the New Stone Age had displayed none of their predecessors' love of drawing, but they immediately evinced a most remarkable aptitude for working in gold and bronze. Torques, rings, and bracelets of extreme beauty have been discovered belonging to this period. As the country was sparsely populated, there was room enough for wave after wave of immigrants. The newcomers would not be regarded altogether as foreigners, for in a race, language, and civilization, the inhabitants of both sides of the English Channel were identical. Thus the new mingled peaceably with the old, without any of the fierce struggles which form so hideous an aspect of the later migrations. But this period of calm was soon to be interrupted. A new people appeared on the scene, a branch of the great Celtic people to whom, for purposes of identification and differentiation, the name Goidels has been given. These people were more warlike than the older inhabitants of the island. Nevertheless, there was no settled policy of extermination or even of expropriation, but slow and silent pressure did its work. The Iberians were gradually pushed into the remoter corners of the West, and especially into the mountainous region, which we now call Wales. It is unnecessary perhaps to impress upon the reader that there was never a time anything resembling a Celtic empire, or even a Celtic nation. It is only the name which we give to a branch of the Aryan or Indo-European family of races, which migrated at a very early date from Central Asia to the banks of the Rhine, the Main and the Danube. They became known to the Greeks of classical times, who call them Hyperboreans. A martial folk they were, delighting in combat and always thirsting for fresh conquests, for glory, and for plunder. Their first struggle was with the Germanic tribes, whom they eventually subjugated. Dionysius and Halicarnassus, a writer of the 1st century BC, refers to Germany and Celtic territory, but after a time the Germans turned on their masters and expelled them from what had been their first European home, the region which lies between the Elbe and the Rhine. It is but natural that wandering nations should in all ages have felt attracted by France. To those particularly who came from the arid and frozen steppes of Russia, or from the wind-swept Scandinavian lands, its sunny plains, its fine rivers, its fields so well adapted for the cultivation of grain, its gentle hills on whose slopes the vine flourishes so luxuriantly, must have seemed a veritable paradise. It is therefore not in the least surprising that, from the earliest dawn of history, race should have striven with race for the possession of so fair an inheritance. Among the first invaders within the period of recorded history were the Celts, who invaded France somewhere about the year 600 BC. Their second invasion occurred some time after 300 BC. This time they swept over the whole country from the Channel to the Bay of Biscay, and from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. The land was then called Gaul, and these were the people against whom the whole might of Rome were directed under the leadership of Julius Caesar. Invaders and invaded were closely akin in blood. After a stubborn resistance, the whole country was subjugated. Latin civilization was speedily assimilated, and Gaul became, after a time, more Roman almost than Rome itself. Even at this distant date, nowhere is it more easy to enter into the spirit of ancient Rome than within the gaunt and gigantic amphitheatre of Arles, by the exquisite mason car of Nimes, and beneath the stupendous aqueduct of Pont de Gard. But as the power of Rome declined, new torrents of invaders swept into Gaul, in successive waves, Burgundian giving place to Visigoth and Visigoth to Frank. Meanwhile the Celts, who had been living on the banks of the Danube, had not been idle. For them the path of sunshine and ease led in the direction of Italy and the Balkan Peninsula. Italy, more even than France, has at all times possessed a wonderful, though quite explicable, fascination for the northern nations. Its fine climate, the fertility of its soil, its high state of cultivation, and its accumulated riches have proved an irresistible attraction. From the picturesque pages of Livy, it is easy to gather that the steady progress of the invaders, the forcing of the Alpine barrier, the march across the northern plain, the pouring through the passes of the Apennines, the capture of Clusium, and finally the holding to ransom of Rome itself, made a profound and indelible impression upon the Romans. It is altogether to the credit of the Celts that they respected the superior civilization which they found in the lands south of the Alps, and that they committed no crimes or outrages like those perpetrated at a later date by Vandals and Huns. These Celtic tribes, having conquered Macedon and Thessaly, accepted an invitation from Nicomedes, king of Bithynia, and crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. With their aid, Nicomedes speedily defeated his enemies, but it was not long before he had good reason to repent of having brought to the country such formidable allies. The Celts had brought with them their families and all their belongings, and now they settled down on both sides of the river Hales. There they formed a state called Galatia, and became the terror of all their neighbours. Incensed with Mithridates the Great on account of his treachery, they allied themselves with the Romans in the war against him, and after that they remained a Roman client state. Even then they retained their language, and we have it on the authority of St. Jerome that 6 centuries later the same tongue was spoken on the banks of the Hales, as on the banks of the Moselle. With their language they also retained their customs and character, but recent commentators have perhaps been too ready to find evidence of the instability and impressionableness of the modern Welshman in St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians. From France, the step was a comparatively easy one into Spain, but once across the Pyrenees, the forward march of the Celts was stubbornly contested. The country was in the hands of a strange assortment of people, consisting of a pre-Aryan race, Iberians, Ligurians, and Phoenicians. Nothing could, however, resist the Celtic advance, and ere long we find them firmly planted in Portugal and among the hills of Galicia and Asturias. It will be seen from this that the invasion of Britain by the Goidels was but part of a mighty movement of expansion carried out by the Celts in many different countries. Britain they probably reached some time about the year 800 BC. Soon the tin mines of Cornwall acquired something like European fame, and men of enterprise like Pythias came from the ports of the Mediterranean to seek the pearls and gold so dear to the luxurious inhabitants of southern islands. But it was not until Gaul had become a Roman province, peacefully and well-ordered and traversed by excellent roads, that Britain came to be regarded as a place within the ordinary range of commercial intercourse. The last wave of invaders to enter Britain anterior to the coming of the Romans were the Brythons, another branch of the Celtic family. It is probable that they came from the northeastern Gaul at a date which we cannot fix with any precision, but which might have been some time between the 4th and 1st century BC. The people found by them in Britain were but poor fighters, and the resistance offered by them to the Brythonic invaders was feeble and brief. They were speedily conquered and pushed back into the countries of the north and west. At what date they came first to Wales we do not know, but before the end of the Roman occupation we find them living in what is now Montgomeryshire. The Brythons differed in many ways from their predecessors. They were tall, well-formed, with long yellow hair, faces shaved clean except for a moustache, light-complexioned, agile of limb, and hardy. While excelling in war, they were not unmindful of the arts of peace. They were an artistic people, and the weapons and ornaments which they wrought in various metals, as well as their enamel work, are exquisite in design and workmanship. Many of their spindles, their loom weights, and their weaving combs had survived. Julius Caesar draws attention to their superb horsemanship. They had also made some headway in the art of boat building. Yet despite the advanced stage of civilization indicated by these things, their mode of life was barbarous. Their huts show practically no advance upon those of earlier people, being circular in shape, with floors of clays and walls of timber and wattle, the interstices being filled with mud. Almost invariably the hut consisted of a single room, in which the whole family laid itself down to sleep, covered with woolen blankets and rugs made of the skins of animals. They knew the value of trade, and before the coming of the Romans used a coinage. The language which they spoke is the direct ancestor of that spoken today in Wales and Brittany, just as the Goidelic branch of the parent Celtic tongue is the ancestor of Erse and Gaelic. Julius Caesar's 2 invasions of Britain could not have made much difference in the mode of life of the inhabitants of the country. They paid their tribute and were left alone, and after a time even the tribute seems to have been forgotten. All that remained of his conquest was the graphic, though incomplete account which Caesar left of Britain in his Gallic War, and the lingering memory of this remote outpost of the empire, a memory which awakened into life at a later date and inspired ambitious emperors and generals with a desire for conquest. After the final departure of Caesar, it was well nigh 100 years before the Romans again interfered with the Britons. The period between 54 BC and AD 43 is obscure in the annals of the island. No doubt commercial intercourse with Gaul was constant, and Roman culture must have percolated slowly into the country by that channel. The names of some of the British kings who ruled have come down to us. It was the year AD 43, during the reign of the Emperor Claudius and the Roman general Aulus Plautius, set out at the head of 4 legions to reconquer Britain. While the campaign was still in progress, the emperor himself arrived, but his sojourn was only 16 days in duration, and to him belongs none of the credit for the conquest. It was against Caractacus and Togodumnus, sons of the late king Cunobelinus, that Aulus Plautius directed his march. Their capital was Camaldonum, the modern Colester. Many of the neighbouring tribes espoused the Roman cause, and in 4 years' time Aulus was able to return to Rome, having completed the task of conquering southeastern England from Kent to Norfolk. The next Roman leader to be sent to Britain was Publius Osturius Scapula, and under him the theatre of war shifted to the north and west. Those parts of the island which have hitherto remained practically unexplored. The nature of the struggle likewise changed. The tribes hitherto encountered by the Romans were closely akin to the people of Gaul, and their civilizations also was very similar in quality. They were people who valued peace and commerce, and who, when they had recovered from the first shock of outraged independence, were content to become Roman tributaries. But the tribes inhabiting the Welsh mountains were far less civilized. Of trade they knew practically nothing, and very little about the settled pursuit of agriculture. But they loved freedom, and were prepared again and again to rise in its defence. The first task which Osturius set himself was the conquest of the Ticangi, who dwelt, according to Tacitus, on the shore of the Irish Sea. He raided their territory, but before anything like a conquest had been effected, he was called away to deal with the far more turbulent and warlike Silures of the south. These were the inhabitants of the Monmouth and Glamorgan, and they were now under the leadership of the famous Caraticus. This able man had concluded an alliance with the neighbouring Ordovices, and the united tribes were able to offer a stiff resistance to Roman aggression. It was not until the war had lasted many years, and Caraticus had won several victories, that the persistence and the superior science of Astorius were rewarded with success. The site of the final battle is uncertain, but it may well have been near Church Stretton, at the spot now called Ser Sardoc. At this battle, Caraticus was defeated and taken prisoner, later to be led in triumph through the streets of Rome. This was probably the year AD 51. Following on the death of Asturias in AD 52, the Silures recovered a degree of liberty, but with the arrival of new Roman general Quintus Veranius in AD 58, the struggle began afresh. Veranius, however, died in a few months before he had accomplished anything, and his place was taken by the truly great Suetonius Paulinius. This consummate general adopted the plan of building strong forts at various strategic points all over Britain, from which the legions could control the surrounding country. Two of these forts were placed close to the Welsh border, one at Chester, the other at Roxter. Chester, for many generations after its foundation, was the base of operations for all military expeditions launched against North Wales. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story, and if you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Bore You to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.